Red alert!
What?
You know, 'cause it's red.
Oh my god. Hello everyone, I'm Alex, also known as Obsessive Costuming Dude, author of the Star Trek Costume Guide.
And I am Yogurt.
And in this video we're going to take a look at a front-zipping, later style TNG jumpsuit.
So, how many of these are we going to look at anyway?
Well, this is probably the last one, but we haven't looked at one like this yet. We looked at a ladies' jumpsuit that zips up the back, but this is a men's jumpsuit from the later seasons that zips up the front.
If you say so.
Now, a few quick things before we get started. First, I want to thank the owner of this costume, Angelo Cafaldi, for letting us examine it and make this video for you.
Angelo's in the outfield.
What?
Hey, was he in that?
I don't know. I don't think so. Anyway, number two, if you want to learn more about the TNG jumpsuits, I've written an actual costume analysis, which you can read on my blog, www.startrekcostumeguide.com. It's also available as a free PDF download.
Doesn't that sound fun?
And finally, I have a special treat for you at the end of the video. So let's take a look at this thing. We've looked at several other TNG jumpsuits now, so I'm going to try and avoid rehashing things I've already talked about in those videos, which you can check out here on my channel. And I definitely recommend you check them out if you're interested in TNG costumes, which I guess you are since you're here. But I will say that the actual fabric color for the TNG red division color is not what you might expect in person, considering how red it looked in the show. It's actually much more of a purpley magenta color, kind of a berry, rather than a full-on red like it looked in the show. And this particular jumpsuit is a bit lighter and paler in color than some of the other examples we've looked at, like the Worf jumpsuit in the previous video. So I don't know if you can see the color difference as much here on camera, but this Captain Picard spandex swatch is a little bit darker and redder than this jumpsuit. And the Worf jumpsuit we looked at is also darker than this one. It's more of a dark, kind of a burgundy color, whereas this jumpsuit is more of a lighter, paler, more of a neutral magenta color. So this jumpsuit is definitely a bit of a lighter color than we've seen so far. If you don't have any costume cards, to help give you an idea of the fabric color, you can go to your local hardware store and get this paint chip. It's a Valspar 1010-7 Berry Brown. It's the closest one I was able to find. It's actually the same paint chip that I found to be the best match for the Admiral Jameson uniform from Season 1 and the Worf jumpsuit that we looked at in the previous video. It's also the same paint chip that I found to be the best match for this jumpsuit, but it's not as good of a match for this one. It's a little too dark and a little too red, but you can check it out if you're interested. Unlike the Incencito jumpsuit we looked at from Season 7, which had the weave of the spandex going vertical and the stretch going horizontal around the wearer's body, this is a jumpsuit from the later seasons with the spandex cut so the weave is horizontal and the stretch is going up and down like the early TNG jumpsuits were. And really, it seems like most of the TNG jumpsuits were cut with the spandex oriented like this. I've said it many times, I have no idea why. I thought for a while that it might have been an issue with the width of the spandex fabric yardage. If the yardage was only 44 or 48 inches wide, it might be difficult to fit a jumpsuit onto the fabric yardage. But these jumpsuits are in so many different little pieces, it's no trouble at all to cut these little things oriented so they stretch around the wearer's body. The biggest pieces are really the pant legs, but even those will fit pretty easily onto the spandex yardage if you want the stretch to go in that direction. But for whatever reason, it seems like most of the TNG jumpsuits were cut like this, even in the later seasons with the weave going horizontal and the stretch going up and down. However, as with the Incencito jumpsuit, the collar isn't anywhere near as interfaced as I had originally guessed. I would have thought that there was some heavy canvas or collar interfacing inside the collar, but it's actually pretty squishy. But it doesn't stretch, so it is interfaced, and it does feel a little thicker. My guess would be that the collar was interfaced with just a single layer of fusible interfacing on the underside. If you've read my costume analysis, you might remember that the style of this asymmetrical front changed considerably over the years. As it was originally designed by William Tice in Season 1, it was actually quite jagged, and that continued into Season 2 as those uniforms were used. But in Season 2, when Dorinda Rice Wood took over, she moved this apex, or corner, over a bit toward the outside, so it was more of a subtle detail than it was in Season 1. And then in Season 3, when Robert Blackman took over as costume designer, both of those uniform styles continued to be used for the rest of the show, and for when these uniforms were seen in the other shows in the movies. Interestingly, many of the seam lines on this jumpsuit are quite a bit straighter than all the other jumpsuits we've looked at. If you look at the side front seams here, these are almost just straight lines, whereas all the other jumpsuits we've looked at, especially the women's, were more curved here on the front. But like I said, these are nearly straight lines. And the same is true for this lower asymmetrical insert here. This is basically just a straight line up and down again. And down here on the lower front, you can see these lower front outer seams are still curved, but at the center front where the zipper is, on the other jumpsuits we've looked at, especially the women's, the seam was actually cinched in a little bit up toward the waist. But on this jumpsuit, it's almost just a straight line up. It's actually let out a little bit up toward the waist, which is the opposite of what we've seen on the other ones. I don't know if maybe the extras jumpsuits had a different cut or a different standard to them than the hero jumpsuits had. Or maybe this was an attempt by Robert Blackman to simplify the design of these crazy jumpsuits, where they have so many body panels and almost every edge of every piece is at least a little curved, and all the seams are fitted and everything. It's just nuts. Or maybe, like I said, just for the extras jumpsuits, they didn't bother fitting every single seam on the thing and just straightened out as many of the lines as they could to just try and achieve your standard numeric sizing. And then maybe they were altered a little bit as needed if there were specific extras or supporting characters on the day who needed adjustments. Who knows? So with this being a uniform from the later seasons, obviously there's no division-colored trim here in these splits at the bottom of the pant legs. And the construction method is the same as it was on the Encino jumpsuit that we looked at. Although, I have the impression that the top of the splits on her uniform were maybe a little bit more square or rounded, or at least wider. Whereas on this jumpsuit, they taper to a sharper corner like that. I could be wrong about that though. The elastic stirrups at the bottom of the pant legs were attached the same way they were on the Dr. Crusher jumpsuit we looked at from Season 1. Top stitched just above the hemline and then secured with a stitch in the ditch along the pant leg seams. As I mentioned earlier, this jumpsuit closes up the front, and at the top, on the yoke, beneath the collar, there are a couple hook and eye closures above the zipper. And you can actually see the stitching a little bit on the right side. Whoopsie. So I'll undo those. There they are. Beneath that is the invisible zipper, which is actually 23 inches long, plus a few more inches beneath the stop, which makes me think that this is probably a custom-made invisible zipper rather than the standard retail ones that we've seen on the other jumpsuits. Here you can see the collar and neckline seam allowances are pressed upward into the collar, and the collar lining is hand-sewn along the lower edge of the seam line. At the center front, all the seam allowances are clipped and actually go downward, presumably to accommodate and protect this raw edge of the collar piping. And at the center front, along the frontmost inch or so, there's a layer of lightweight fusible interfacing on the underside of the yoke. Right here at the upper body and yoke seam line, the seam allowances are actually tacked down by hand. The center front / zipper seam allowance is nice and big, a full inch all the way up and down the zipper. The jumpsuit came with the original shoulder pads, and as you can see, these things are huge. They're in the same neighborhood as the shoulder pads that came with the Admiral Jameson uniform from Season 1 that I mentioned a few times now. But they're more structured like the shoulder pads that came with the Encino uniform we looked at. You might remember that the Season 1 style shoulder pads, like we saw in the Season 1 Admiral uniform, the TNG skint, and the Wesley Crusher sweater that I posted about on my blog were all made with plain lining fabric. But the shoulder pads that came with the Incencito jumpsuit were made out of a more durable fabric like this. I don't know exactly what it is, but the closest thing I know of to it is polyester gabardine. I don't know if that's what this is or not, but that's what I use to make replica shoulder pads, and it gets the job done. There's also this interfacing inside the pad, and I don't know if you can see it or not, but both the interfacing and the padding are pad stitched, which curves the pad into its shape. And unlike the Incencito jumpsuit, the neckline edge of the interfacing is actually bound, which keeps the strands of interfacing from poking out like they did on her shoulder pads. Interestingly, these shoulder pads are actually two separate shoulder pads, stacked on top of each other and hand sewn together. You can see the hand sewing around the edges. This jumpsuit appears to have been fitted to a specific actor. If you see in the tag, it says Mr. Scranton, and then each of the shoulder pads has a tag in it that says Michael Scranton. I did some research just to try and find who this actor played, but the only Michael Scranton to come up on Memory Alpha was a guy who played a Romulan extra in Unification, which is cool, but there was no mention of him ever playing a Starfleet officer. And the only thing I found on Google was the Memory Alpha entry. IMDb wasn't much help either. There's a number here in the tag, 164. Assuming that's a production number of some kind, the 1 might be superfluous. You know, the pilot might be episode 101, 102, and then the next episode is 103, and so on and so on. If we ignore the 1, episode number 64 is The Offspring. But that was in season 3, and at that point all the extras were still wearing the jumpsuits from seasons 1 and 2, so that doesn't line up with this. If it's actually episode number 164, that would be the Pegasus from season 7. And I went through that episode, but I didn't see anyone wearing a jumpsuit that looked like this.
Fine. Then we'll have to do this the hard way.
I went through most of the show just trying to pinpoint when this jumpsuit might have been used in an episode, and I narrowed it down to a couple guys who just sat at the helm in some episodes, but I can't say for sure if it was actually them or which one it was. There's another number in here, 42, with the 2 being crossed out with a heavier 4 over it, and that's the sizing number. But here's what's weird. It looks like it originally said 42, and someone said, oops, crossed out the 2 and wrote 4 over it, like it was supposed to be size 44. But this jumpsuit actually started its life as a size 44, and it was taken in to a size 42, which is exactly the opposite of what we see here on the tag. You can see here the side seam allowances are huge where it was taken in to a size 42 chest. But if you let all this back out, it's actually a size 44 chest. The seam allowances where the yoke meets the body are a little wonky too, where it was fitted. This would also explain why the shoulder pads were double layered. Even though you can take in things like the chest and the waist, there's only so much you can do with an oversized yoke, so you would need that extra padding to help fill it out. The waist seam allowance is wonky too. You can see this panel has just the bare amount of seam allowance possible. Here you can see the inseam was taken in quite a bit as well. Like we've seen on some of the other jumpsuits, this corner area was stabilized with some fusible interfacing, and the seam allowances are pressed open. The back seam allowances are a little weird. There's the fusible interfacing in the corner area, just like on the front, and the seam allowances are pressed open until we get to here. And then they're pressed like that, which I don't think we've seen before. Like I mentioned earlier, the lower pant legs were done the same way they were on the Incencito jumpsuit we looked at, but the lower facings here on this jumpsuit are quite a bit narrower than all the other jumpsuits we've looked at. Normally, these facings are pretty wide, like that, but it doesn't really matter how wide the facing is, so long as you can do the opening and turn it under, but these are quite a bit narrower than we've seen on the other jumpsuits. Curiously, the edges of the facings were secured with more conventional hem stitching, rather than the catch stitching that we've seen on all the other jumpsuits. Both the sleeves and the pant legs were also hemmed with the hem stitching, rather than the catch stitching that we've always seen.
I put tags with my name on them inside all my clothes, too.
Okay.
It makes me feel like a star. Plus, if people examine them in 30 years, they'll know who wore them.
That works. And now, as promised, a special treat for everyone. I patterned this jumpsuit using a technique that I learned in this book, 101 Sewing Secrets from the Singer Reference Library, using what they call the rub-off technique.
Who comes up with these names?
I don't know. Anyway, I'm putting the pattern that I extrapolated from this uniform up on my blog where you can download it for free.
You should work on your presentation, Alec.
What do you mean?
Well, you kind of set it up like it was cake and ice cream.
Anyway, you can check it out at www.StarTrekCostumeGuide.com.
You'll have to get your cake and ice cream somewhere else, though.
That's true.
If you need some recommendations, I can send you a detailed list. Email Alec if you're interested.
Don't do that.
Comment below with your favorite kinds.